This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Dr. Leon Aron, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and is an issue area expert on Russia and U.S.-Russia relations. They discuss the Russian invasion and war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression against the Ukrainian people, and broader implications on European security. They also cover the emerging threat of a new geopolitical axis between Russia and China.
Dr. Leon Aron, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to have you here. You are well known as an expert on Russia and Europe more broadly. Eager to have you give us the latest in terms of how you're seeing it in the war in Ukraine and Russia's war of aggression on the people of Ukraine, and then we'll have a broader conversation about European security and the challenges the United States is facing, not just from Vladimir Putin and Russia, but more broadly from this emerging axis, which is led by the People's Republic of China. But first, Leon, give us the latest on where things stand and with respect to Putin's war on Ukraine.
Well, let me give you something in the longer run, which we tend to forget. Putin's challenge is to keep social peace while really bleeding Russia, both in terms of cannon fodder and money for this war. And so far he managed okay, although the inflation is 7% and the Bank of Russia just hiked the prime rate to 19%, trying to keep the inflation low. The inflation is a time bomb because Putin literally loosened the string purse. There's a flood of money that he actually had been harboring in preparation for this war. The salaries are high. The trillions of rubles and billions of dollars are thrown at the military-industrial complex. And when you have, at the same time, a sharp reduction of imports, a sharp reduction of consumer goods because people are either drafted in the army or workers went for the higher salaries in the military-industrial complex, you have a classic situation where you have an enormous money mass and increasing shortage of consumer goods. So that's the classic situation with that. A sharper problem is, although still managed by him in long term in terms of social peace, is of course the enormous rate of casualties in Ukraine. The latest is about 200,000 killed, and overall killed and wounded and taken out of action could be up to 750,000.
Wow, that is more than we're hearing. I mean, what you get bandied about in Washington is this 300,000 number of combined killed and wounded.
That's not true. These are both the Russian sources, and I suggest to your readers also a very authoritative piece in The Economist, and also the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom. I think all good sources. But let me finish on this.
Yeah.
What we saw in Ukraine's sudden lightning offensive in the Kursk region, southern region of Russia, is hundreds of captured conscripts. Now, these are not reservists. These are not regular army. These are boys out of high school with minimal training, if any, thrown into the battle. This is a very hot potato. After the wars in Afghanistan and in Chechnya, by the Soviet Union and then subsequently Russia, there was a tremendous, and continues to be, a tremendous opposition in the society to sending raw recruits into the battle. And incidentally, in March of 2022, barely a month after the invasion, Putin solemnly pledged that the conscripts will not be sent in. It will be the reservists, and it will be a professional military. Well, he grabbed 300,000 reservists. He mobilized, by the way, by turning Russian army essentially in a mercenary force, enormous sign-up bonuses. He raided the prisons to the point of presumably hiring about 58,000 prisoners, lured not only by high pay, but also by presidential pardons, including those for rapists and murderers. And he still needs cannon fodder. He still needs the bodies. And this is something that we really have to watch carefully. The final, as they say, the takeaway is this. So long as the West continues to be patient, to support the heroic people and heroic army of Ukraine, this battle, contrary to what Putin says and to what some of our own pessimists would say, the outcome is not at all solved, not at all there.
Very interesting. We're with Dr. Leon Aron, who's the senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute, an expert on U.S.-Russia relations, and himself a refugee who left Moscow, I believe, Russia in the late 70s.
Right.
Someone who is not looking at Western translations of Russian sources, but working off primary material. A lot you outlined there, Leon, and interesting. I want to get to that last point you made in just a minute, because it runs a little counter, as you noted, to what you hear in Washington. But let's just talk about wartime Russia. And one of the things that I think has become something that people in Washington, D.C., policymakers, elected officials are grappling with is this idea that Vladimir Putin is all in, that he has converted the entire country, its economy, around winning in Ukraine. And you outlined elements of that just in the beginning of our conversation. I guess the question that I want to ask was a little bit in terms of where you just ended a moment ago is this sustainable? Two things, right? Economically, can he continue just to spend on this war to the exclusion of all other elements of the economy, as the West, perhaps imperfectly, is limiting what he can do? We'll talk about China in a minute. That's bailing Putin out. And at the same time, can he continue to avoid everyday Russians feeling the impact of this war, given, as you just said a moment ago, this is 700,000 Russians either killed or wounded in this conflict, and now Russia is taking conscripts, right? This is kind of a czarist approach to fueling a Russian war by kids out of high school and putting them on the front lines, as you just said, cannon fodder. So give me your prediction, Leon, in terms of how long could Vladimir Putin's Russia sustain this? You know, there were others in the past who thought Russia would just eventually have to give. I think of Napoleon or Hitler, and in the end, they were consumed by Russia, not the opposite way.
Well, to your point, Roger, a historic point. Yes, Napoleon and Hitler, but it's a reverse. Nobody invaded Russia. There is no force marching thousands of miles in increasingly cold weather. As you know, both Napoleon and Hitler were hit by record cold weathers, whether it's the winter of 1812 or 1941. So this is the opposite. Look, this is, of course, a $5 million question. How long can he sustain it? Well, it depends, first of all, on the things that I mentioned, which is keeping the social peace by essentially bribing the population and by keeping the casualties at a manageable level. And by that I mean, 700,000 is hardly manageable in a democracy, but in a closed society where there is no truthful data, where the television is dominated by propaganda, it could be prolonged. One other possibility for Putin is essentially reintroducing, he's already at the level of terror of the late Soviet Union. I mean, I've lived in the late Soviet Union. This is worse. So So yes, if he goes North Korea way, if he goes China way, if he goes Cuba way, then of course that would prolong the war. The question is, would he risk this? The big question here is how much the mass of the population, we're not talking about the intelligentsia, we're not talking about those 500,000 at least who left Russia already in protest. We're not talking about those who hate this war but stayed. We're talking about the people, Putin's base, who are really indifferent and the salaries are higher and who cares? That so long as somebody fights it, it's not my son, it's okay. Whether they will eventually start grumbling about their sons conscripted and sent to the army, to Ukraine, whether the inflation begins to consume their savings and higher salaries, that's a big question. And Putin, he's very clever. He deploys just enough repression, just enough terror to suppress, of course, the loci of active resistance, but generally leave the mass of the population alone. And I'm talking here about travel abroad. I'm talking about much reduced, but still access to the internet. And the consumer goods that are largely Chinese now, and almost all the cars now in Russia are Chinese.
So you have the elites still have some level of freedom. They're looking the other way.
I would say economic opportunity. It's not freedom.
Yes, well, it's certainly not political freedom.
Economic choice that the older generation still compares to the poverty of the Soviet Union and finds acceptable.
Let me just go to a development on the battlefield, because I think it plays on Russian reactions and their view of the conflict. At least I assume it does, and that's Kursk. Zelensky's military recently, in the past month, took Russian territory. Consequential Russian territory, historic territory. It was the site of the largest tank war battle, in the Second World War, and now you have this outcome where, for now, at the time of this recording, Ukraine is holding Russian territory, unprecedented, and it seems to be an operation, one, the U.S. wasn't aware of, we're told, but two, that it has some sort of strategic impact, certainly in the mindset of Ukrainians, and it's forced in a kind of an operational way Russians off their game, we think, where they have to reinforce and try to take back that territory, which, of course, relieves some pressure on the front, where the line of contact between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Give me your take on Kursk and how, if at all, it's having a strategic impact on the war and on Putin's calculus.
Well, with regard to Ukraine, I mean, Roger, wars of attrition are as much decided at home as they are on the battlefield. I mean, the wars of attrition are decided also, as I said, by the morale of the population, by their desire, their ability, their wish to support the war. So in that regard, of course, Russia lost in Kursk, and Zelensky, Ukraine won, because it was an enormously effective, I think, shot in the arm to the population of Ukraine. We can do it. It was also a demonstration to the West of the process that I mentioned before. Putin's war is, yes, he ensconced it in a kind of protective shell. But the durability of that shell and how the fragility of that shell is a big question. And this is what they punched. Now, notice that from the very beginning, I think Putin, knowing very well what's going on, he has, after the initial lies he was fed before the invasion, that we will march to Kyiv in 3 days, I believe he now requires some more or less honest information about the war. He never said, "Oh, we will expunge them, we will expel them, in a week. He knew he wouldn't. And as far as we know, look, this is not a huge force. As far as we know, what, 7,000, 10,000 at the most Ukrainians. Putin cannot find enough troops to go there. This shows, again, as I mentioned, how stretched out he is, how strained he is. And this is something that I hope the Western supporters of Ukraine take notice.
So let's talk about the Western supporters of Ukraine. Consensus here, don't really argues, is that the United States in particular has not given Ukraine support that would allow them to have a decisive impact on the battlefield. It's been the slow bleed of capabilities. This calculus criticized here regularly of a fear of escalation, fear of at a certain point it was spooked by the possibility that Putin may use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, tactical nuclear weapons. At the outset of this conversation, Leon, you said, hey, the West needs to be, my words, but it was the implication, stick with it because Putin eventually is going to run out of manpower, run out of the capabilities and money. But the critique from those who'd like to see the U.S. do everything it can to support Ukraine is we're running out of time. This is an urgent problem. Ukraine can't sustain this, and this is not just the people in D.C. speaking. This is what Vladimir Zelensky said when he was in Washington last, and continues to say: give us the decisive weapons and allow us to target into Russian territory the sources of where they're attacking Ukraine and where they've been effective in attacking Ukrainians.
Roger, I've been worried about this for the past 6 years. If you look at the last chapter of my recently published book, Riding the Tiger, I actually outlined a scenario that might take place if the West allows Ukraine to start using longer range missiles and hit Russia's communication and ammunition hubs. That would be an enormous advantage to Ukraine and, of course, a huge detraction to Russia's ability to conduct a war. Now, if Putin sees that he cannot, like all the dictators, Saddam Hussein, Hitler, he cannot pull out of this war without declaring victory. The Russians are very patient with their rulers, but I could rattle off changes of regimes in both Russia and the Soviet Union after a decisive military setback. He knows that history. He knows that he does not have an overwhelming patriotic support. He has indifference, and that's fine with him for now. Mm-hmm. But if he begins to lose this war, he may up the ante. The Russians call it escalate to de-escalate. And the scenario that I outlined in a number of articles, but also at the last chapter of the book that was published about a year ago, is that he may decide to up the ante and directly confront NATO. Mm-hmm. Somewhere on the eastern periphery. I suggest Latvia or Estonia, just because it gives him a fig leaf to say, a quarter of the population are ethnic Russians, and there's, sort of play the Crimea scenario. Confront them there, declare parts, very small part, of those places Russia, and then in the Russian military doctrine it says that he, well, they don't name him, but when the Russian state is in danger, their leadership could resort to nuclear weapons. He could say, well, this is our territory. You want to dislodge us. You want to attack. You're attacking Russia now. So he will bring the world to the brink of a nuclear war, not because he wants to fight it. He's not a madman, but because this is his last trump card. Nuclear blackmail, and then he'll step back, or at least I think, sort of like a Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, let's step back from the abyss and let's negotiate the overall settlement, which of course he hopes that the West would be so scared that it essentially will grant him sort of the so-called peace in Ukraine, which of course, essentially will be his victory. So, allowing Ukraine to use those weapons, I think, is a necessary but a risky step, so long as the West prepares to handle Putin's nuclear blackmail.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the calculus that the Biden administration has sought to avoid throughout.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
this Russian doctrine of
it's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a tough. I mean, but what seems to have happened is the very things they thought would lead to that escalation and the nuclear brinkmanship that you've described hasn't actually played out when the Attackams got there and they started targeting the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, and the Ukrainians unilaterally using their own missiles and drones targeted into Russian territory, and it just hasn't happened. But yes, I mean, the escalate to de-escalate doctrine is something certainly the Biden administration has emphasized directly and indirectly in the press. The other piece of it, and this is where I want to go to for the balance of our conversation, again, when we're with Dr. Leon Aron of the American Enterprise Institute, an expert in U.S.-Russia relations, as well as author of Riding the Tiger, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the Uses of War, came out in 2023, is that that the trump card that Vladimir Putin has is, of course, China here. And you wrote a very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal this past summer where you outlined the nature of this axis and the support that, in particular, Xi has been giving to Putin and the rationale for it. Take a couple minutes and outline how vital Xi's support to Putin has been in this conflict, in this war, and a little bit of the rationale, what we're seeing for why China and Xi, President Xi, has done this.
China's support is vital. I mean, this is not a hyperbole. This is not just a pretty word. It's been recognized finally, openly, both by the EU summit and a rather recent summit, a NATO summit here in New York, in Washington, D.C., where the leaders of the NATO nations and the EU before that said China is a lifeline to Russia. In my article that you mentioned, there are numbers. Half of the Russian oil and gas, primarily oil, lifeline. This is lifeblood for Russia, because after all the sanctions, this is the only thing that it could really use for money. Half of it comes from China, although India also contributes to it greatly. And also, Russia spends about 380 million, I think, or close to it, every day on the battlefield. And China makes for over 60% of that expense. So that's just to show you how vital that support is. Now, when people try to explain, my colleagues try to explain the support that China gives, they point to obvious facts. Well, it's a sort of a rehearsal, a dress rehearsal for ostensibly Xi's attack on and capture of Taiwan. It is gives China ways into, or reveals the technology that the West supplies to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. All the things correct and all the things operational. My concern in that article was that the support for Putin goes much deeper in Xi Jinping's personal psychology. And I give examples of all from his original speeches, where literally 2 months after he became the general secretary and the president, of course, in 2012, early in 2013, he gave a speech where he said, essentially yanked the Communist Party that kind of grew, a little freewheeling and fat and lazy, back to the Procrustean bed of Marxism. We're Marxists. We're building communism. Yes, we call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, but don't get, and we have some private property, don't lose sight of the final goal. The final goal is the communism, and the final goal is the defeat of the decadent capitalist West.
Deeply ideological is what it bears out, what you're writing, and others point to this too. Seems to be for kind of those who want a more realpolitik view of the world, tend to marginalize that element of Xi's leadership and his approach to geopolitics. Leon, why is that important? Why is it important to emphasize that? How is that relevant to kind of U.S. decision making and the geopolitics and facing this axis?
Roger, as we make this mistakes over and over and over again. We made it with Lenin. Oh, this is just, he's just a progressive rebel. We made it with Stalin. Oh, he just wants to build an industrial society. God knows we made it with the Soviet leaders. Oh, they don't have any ideology. They're just sort of floating around. And every time after their deaths, after the archives are open, we realize that no, they're Castro and the Kims and Xi are true believers. It's true that they may couch it in terms that are acceptable in the current political environment, but they never stepped back from this. Neither the Soviet leaders, nor the Nazi leaders, nor any other dictators. And so the problem here is that I think I begin my article by saying, well, I think it was Stubbs, the president of Finland, said, let's beg China, let's press China. It can end this war with one phone call. Now, strictly speaking, if you take ideology out of it, sure, she will call Putin and say, stop the war, or else we'll stop supporting you, which of course Russia will go bankrupt. But will he make that phone call? And I argue, no, he won't, because a key part of Marxism is a very interesting doctrine of historical materialism. And this is how the societies develop. And the societies develop based on the economic progress. You reach certain level of economy, the political superstructure, values, political institutions have to give way. And so what happened when China undertook those reforms 40 years ago is another very important Marxist, Deng Xiaoping, which we also misunderstood. We thought, oh, he's just an economic reformer.
Well, he opened up the economy, so we tend to focus on that.
But he also said that the idea is to bide your time and not reveal your capabilities. Why did he say that? Because as a learned Marxist, remember, he was one of the founders of the Communist Party of China. He knew or believed that, as Marx said, first you have to build an economic base.
Right.
After you build the economic base, you can go ahead and change the political superstructure. And so what happens here is that after Deng, everybody sort of forgot about this or pretended they paid lip service, but all the leaders sort of thought, okay, so Marx, yeah, we're Marxists, but that's not what matters. It matters to Xi. And what I hypothesized with, corroborating with facts and quotes is that now that China's economy is 30 times more than it was in the 70s when Deng opened China and introduced limited private property and capitalism. The time has come for China to start changing the political superstructure of the world. What that means is what the Chinese sources and Xi called the international relations based on Western values. And so this is what's under attack here.
And this is something this is the opportunity Xi's exploiting, right? So the idea is that he's backing Putin not because of some deep admiration for
Correct.
Russia. Of course, historically, Russia and China have a long history of conflict.
Yeah.
But it's just another opportunity to damage and weaken and undermine the West, which of course is the determinism that fuels Xi's brand of Marxism. Leon, one argument you get from some policy corners in D.C. is, well, these are reasons for the U.S. not to expose itself and make itself vulnerable with the war in Ukraine. It's actually, if China is the peer competitor, or the adversary that we need to contend with, we should focus on actions that would limit and the kind of Xi's reach and challenge Xi in his backyard, right, in the Pacific. And therefore, it's a losing proposition for U.S. interest to go in too deep with Ukraine, with Zelensky. What's your take on that, Leon?
Well, Roger, these are, I don't see those things as mutually exclusive. Support China, support Ukraine, and yes, continue. We've been pussyfooting around China. The pinpricks of our sanctions. We never sanctioned major institutions of China. We sanctioned a bank here, bank there, the ones that are caught red-handed, exchanging money with Russia. Incidentally, helping, because the banks now, Russia now does not have the dollars. The banks, Chinese banks, are trying to run away from the dollars because that opens them to sanctions. They try to trade. Russia tried rubles. The Chinese said, no way. So it's now yuans, and Russia's accumulating a huge amount of yuans, as, by the way, it accumulated a huge amount of rupees that it doesn't know what to do with. So it works, but the idea is, let's abandon Ukraine and concentrate on China. I think those things are not mutually exclusive at all. And Roger, let's not forget another thing, back to Marxism, that Xi Jinping's teachers and mentors and leaders, right? Lenin, Stalin, Mao, all established communist societies, either during wars or immediately in the aftermath of wars. So Xi is watching very carefully. And of course, Marx said that violence is always accompanies the birth of new societies. Right. So if Putin loses that war, it's not just an operational blow to Xi. It also, to him, as I think, a convinced Marxist says, no, the time has not come yet to attack the West directly, because look what happened.
Well, you could pull the ideology out of it just for a moment. I'm not saying it's not relevant here. I think your arguments are persuasive, but it is a yardstick. It's an opportunity to measure the United States, NATO, and more broadly the West or free societies' willingness to support free states, in this case Ukraine. And if we're unable to do that, and if it's unable to repel Putin's Russia, and then that does indicate to Xi that Taiwan, for example, is on the taking. He was successful, that is, Xi was successful in taking Hong Kong. It's not apples to apples, given its political kind of making compared to Taiwan, but that was a free city that is no longer free, and Taiwan is certainly something that Xi is seeking to bring within his grasp, whether it's done militarily or through other means, through a Hong Kong sort of a framework. But yeah, I tend to agree both in terms of the ideological points you're making that's driving his behavior, but as well as the sort of precedent Ukraine would provide and learning opportunity in terms of the limits of the West's support, which would no doubt impact Xi's calculus. United States successful in supporting Ukraine defend itself, that would impact his calculus. Leon, we're going to go for the lightning round where we ask our guests to share their favorite Reagan quote, speech, or book. We'll take all three, two, or just one.
Okay. It's not easy, but it's simple.
Explain.
A terrific quote. I always feel that, and I always try to parade it wherever I can. Ukraine. It's not easy, but it's simple. Which, by the way, dovetails with another famous saying of Reagan: "We win, they lose." I mean, this is what's at stake. There's ultimately, wars only have one victor and wars only have one defeated party.
Have you seen the Reagan film, the one that's playing in theaters?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, for our listeners and viewers, check it out. The Reagan Foundation wasn't involved in the film, but I had a chance to watch it the other day. And Leon, that quote, "It's not easy, but it's simple."
Yeah.
Actually is captured in the conversation between George Shultz and Reagan. And I thought that's where you're going to go, but you're right. The simple thing is often most difficult to get done, and then it's oftentimes the right thing to do.
Yeah, and of course, what I think the takeaway, as they say, is that Reagan says, keep an eye on the prize. Okay, that's what he means by simple. The rest is technology. The rest, the advisors can do. The leaders should keep an eye on the easy choice. And the easy choice is we win, they lose.
Dr. Leon Aron, thank you so much for being on the show.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.